Good evening, everyone. I'm Jordan Scott Ruiz, and I'm the Prime Minister of this House, and I am here to support the motion that we're bringing to you guys today, which is that this House would ban gender testing in sports. Now, before we get into the points that we're going to bring in favor of this motion, I'm going to set up a model that I hope will frame this debate properly so that we understand what we actually are trying to accomplish by having this motion passed. The model that we are setting forth for this debate is that the government define gender testing as attempting to ascertain an athlete's gender through medical examination, and we hope that through getting this legislation passed, that we can eventually eliminate and phase out gendered sports leagues and gendered sports altogether, in hopes that all athletes can compete against one another, and this will improve sports and society in many ways that I will outline in the speech that I'm going to give right now. The first point that I'm going to bring to you all is that sports are inherently egalitarian, and that truly the best will truly rise to the top, especially if we are dealing with sporting leagues that do have gender testing, such as the Olympics. When you look at the Olympic trials, it doesn't matter what color you are, what background you come from, or what your gender is. If you run the fastest, jump the highest, or score the most points, you are going to get a spot on the team. And if you can look at this and you can see some of the most amazing, spectacular athletes in the world identify as women and outpace their male counterparts in multitudes of ways. If you look at athletes like Serena Williams or Chris Santos, athletes are the athletic ability of an athlete will shine through in their competition, no matter what their gender is, and we do believe that athletes should have a chance to apply their craft on the largest stage for the most amount of compensation, no matter what their gender is. If you look at one of the most beautiful things about sports in society is that you can use sports to overcome race, class, sexuality, and other differences in society that are often looked down upon. So this House sees no reason why gender should be a barrier within sports. We see no reason why that should be the case. The next point that I'm going to bring to you is that by passing this motion, we will create a more equal playing field monetarily for athletes. In the world. When you look at the way the gendered sports system is set up, female athletes are paid exponentially less than their male counterparts. If you look at the average WNBA salary and the average NBA salary, there simply is no comparison, despite the fact that WNBA athletes practice just as hard, work just as hard, and are just as athletically gifted as athletes in the NBA. So we see no reason why this should be the case, why athletes should, because of their gender, be forced to apply their craft.
All right. Would you, in getting rid of all of these barriers, also get rid of age qualifications and weight qualifications?
It really depends on the sport, because we believe that because this is such a broad qualification that sort of like applies to everyone in the population, that by dividing things based on gender, you really are taking huge segments of the athletic population and sort of like putting them in this pen where they'll be earning less money or have less eyes on them, despite the fact that they put just as much effort in. So I don't really see that there's like a real comparison between age or weight qualifications. I mean, you can get older, you can overcome age qualifications, but like your gender, like in the current gendered sports system of today, is not something you can simply age out of. If you identify as a woman or identify as a man, that is what the world that you live in, especially when you're an athlete. So I don't see that there's really a comparison there. I'd also like to bring up the point that if you've been following the news lately, Florida is one of the hugest states for high school football, and one of their most well-known high school football teams just started accepting female players, and this season their quarterback is a woman, and she's an amazing athlete, and their team is doing very well. And this is just the first year they've started accepting female players, so I'm kind of putting that in perspective. So just ahead, in case the opposition wants to come ahead and say that female players will somehow be buried or will not have a place on the field if this is happening, because when you remove gender qualifications from sports, the best athletes do rise to the top, whether they're men or women. next point I'm going to make is that this motion will help prevent discrimination against women, trans people, and non-binary people in the world of sports. I already sort of touched on this before, but the status quo in athletics right now perpetuates a harmful narrative that those who identify as women are weaker by generalization. Not right now. That they are weaker, or that they are less talented than their male counterparts. They are paid less money. They play in front of smaller crowds, and that they are not given nearly as much renown and respect by their fan bases and the people who follow that sport, and we believe this is extremely problematic.
Point of information.
Yeah.
Okay, so wouldn't getting rid of all of these gender qualifications just totally eliminate the need to ban gender testing in the first place, and wouldn't that sort of go against the resolution?
Can you repeat that point?
Right. So if you get rid of all the qualifications, why would you have to ban gender testing? No one would want to gender test anyway. This makes
the point of this is that a lot of sports really there's sort of this it's like a patriarchal system where people really will try to keep those who identify as women out of the team or out of the league. And we believe that by removing all avenues of discrimination, we can more effectively tackle this issue, and gender testing is a huge avenue of discrimination against women and trans people. And also, the emotional impact of having female athletes play in smaller leagues is, really immeasurable, because you're starting off their athletic careers under this presumption that they're always going to be weaker and less worthy than their male counterparts. And we believe this is really harmful to young female athletes to feel like they have to be put sort of on this smaller stage or separated from male athletes, presumably because they are assumed that they will not be playing up to the standard of male athletes, which is ridiculous. And we also believe, this is my final point, that this motion will enhance sports. This will pop bubbles in sports. There are bubbles in sports where it's by gender. People are sort of kept in this smaller arena where they have to compete against the same people. And we believe that athletes learn from one another and can push each other towards peak performance if they are allowed to compete with each other regardless of their gender. It would, as we said before, it would allow female athletes to have a larger portion of the pie when it comes to professional sports and even amateur sports when it comes to awards. And it is for these reasons and more reasons that my partner will bring forward in his speech that we emphatically support this motion.
Sorry, it's 7 minutes, right? I haven't debated anymore.
5 minutes just for his speech. The leader of the opposition.
Sorry.
To begin the case for side opposition,
I'm headless.
him that he has 7 minutes in which to do so, and I get really pissed off if you go over your grace period.
I won't go over the grace
I
period.
don't need power at all. But
Okay. I appreciate that. I don't like being headless, but I also don't like standing all the way back here.
You can adjust it. The hardware just came out.
Yeah. we're
But
good.
you can tilt the screen.
Sorry, this matters. Hi, I'm Dan. How you doing? Okay. How do I look? Is my hair good? Just kidding.
you look awesome good.
Okay. So I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his wonderful speech. I want to really quickly make our burdens clear, because I think that in this debate we have to prove 2 things. One, we are not here to prove that the status quo is good. So that's something that we're not proving. Our second burden is that the ban would be a normative bad. So again, we are not in any way arguing that the status quo is good, that we do think that there are very good things that exist right now in sports and in athletics. We do think that this ban would be bad and that it would be worse for women athletes, it would be worse for trans athletes, and it would be worse for intersex and trans acceptance movements throughout athletics. Quickly, we want to make clear what we're talking about when we say gender testing, because side government gave us a pretty vague definition. Gender testing as it exists in sports today is not someone looking at another human's genitals. What it is it's a test of hormones. Hormones that have a very significant effect on someone's muscle mass, someone's weight ratio, height ratio, someone's ability to perform in athletics. Now, into our arguments. Why it would be bad for women? Because currently, gender testing is a tool of many tools, there's more than one, that ensures fairness in sports. Currently, 1% of the general population is classified as intersex. That number goes up to 4% if you look at general hormone imbalances. That said, the vast majority of people, as well as the vast majority of athletes, are hormonally on the gender binary. That is not a socially constructed binary. That is a very real one. And the reason for single gender sports is to give women an opportunity to appear on TV, to be role models for younger women, to be. They are a response to the toxic masculinity found in sports. They are a response to the way in which sports privileges masculinity, privileges male identities. And they give women who because of being a woman on the hormone spectrum have sometimes less of an ability to compete with hormonally defined men on that same playing field. Also, we want to say that it's how we use gender testing that is often an issue. It's when we make gender testing the be-all, end-all of whether someone can play in a certain sports league. We don't think this should be the case. That said, getting rid of a tool that can help people see someone's weight ratio, someone's height, someone's hormone balance, how they would perform in this specific competitive environment is a good tool to see how to decide on whether someone should participate in a particular league, and that or in a particular competition or sport. Why this would be detrimental to people with trans identities? Because depending on one's point in their transition, for example, a trans man or a trans woman could very feasibly on that gender test with regards to their hormonal balance be classified as the gender into which they are transitioning. So when we get rid of this tool, when we get rid of this unequivocal tool that can suspend doubts, for example, about a person's gender, we open it up for criticism. Trans athletes could now be subject of criticism from other spectators or from other athletes, invalidating their identities, saying that a particular athlete should not be playing, or that a particular athlete identifies as trans for competitive reasons rather than because they truly identify with that gender. And we think that this criticism could be very detrimental for mentally as well as socially and often physically, because of how violent athletics tend to be on someone's general experience in athletics. And again, there is always room for flexibility for people at the margins. This test is not the be-all, end-all, and we firmly believe that our society should change and adapt to new people trying to enter athletic communities. You seem to disagree, though.
Yeah, with a lot. Let me pick which thing I actually want to ask you about. So how is it that this test that's based on your bodily chemistry is going to figure out first how you identify, and then second, make it easier for those people to engage in sports when right now they are so very discriminated against?
I want to make it very clear that the test is in no way a social test. It does not figure out how one identifies. What this test is designed to do is to figure out how someone would fare in a specific competitive environment where the vast majority of all the people in that competitive environment have a very specific, or at least a very specific range of hormonal balances in their system that allow them to compete at certain levels, that give them certain abilities that people without a specific set of hormones would lack. And we also believe that, and my partner will get more into this, that for intersex communities, this gives them much less of a platform specifically for intersex and trans acceptance movements to work off of. Because when gender testing exists, one could say, for example, that this gender test does not classify me. I do not identify with this gender test. I should not be participating in this specific community. And for a variety of reasons, for people at the margins, sometimes you need a system. You need a system to subscribe to the binary to work against it, and we worry that getting rid of this ban would allow for a false solvency in that region. And I think we need more changes to the general athletics environment and less changes to the specific layout of gender testing. We also think that when side government tells us that gender doesn't matter, our society makes gender matter. Girls are less encouraged to participate in athletics and therefore need more role models. And when Serena Williams still doesn't compare in many ways to Roger Federer. And thank you very much.
I didn't know I was supposed to be timing.
Went over time.
I can actually time the next speech. Okay, we thank the leader of the opposition for his speech and call upon the deputy prime minister to deliver the
Okay,
speech
this is what I didn't
Side
get to.
government, reminding him that he has 7 minutes in which to do so. You ready, Derek? And I can give you real time signals. Would you like that?
Talk about the
sorry?
history. Yeah, talk a little bit
Oh,
about the
actually, I haven't
history
given
of
anyone else time signals, so I'm going to
gender
those.
Yeah, I don't need time.
I was blowing
Okay.
coming up with arguments. Yeah. Alright, whenever you're ready, Derek.
First, we would like to reaffirm our model. So when we described that gender testing is ascertaining someone's gender through any type of medical options, and we would also like to eliminate gendered sports in general through initially eliminating gender testing. All medical options include assessing someone's hormones and determining the hormonal balance and whether they have enhancements in some sort in their legs so they can jump higher, or whatever other attributes sports aim to sort of showcase. So the ops arguments about how there needs to be that gender testing is specifically hormonal and that it's not necessarily about appearance, we would like to disagree that even though that there is hormonal testing and that we would like to ban that outright, there is also physical assessment, how coaches in high school, in elementary school, in college, even in when they're scouting for national leagues, they look at someone's physical appearance and they go to male or female sports and they try to determine, okay, now I'm at a male arena, this is the NBA, not the WNBA, so I know all of these people are male. Yes.
Point of clarification. Gender testing should specifically refer to the practice of testing hormones for professional sports, and I think it's an abuse of the resolution to call it just sort of making up your mind about stuff.
Oh, okay, but the term gender testing we would like to define as just as I may look out and determine for myself whether these people seem nice or these people don't seem nice. That's my personal judgment. That's my personal test that I include upon people in similar ways that coaches all around, whether they're scouting for the NBA or scouting for the NFL, they do these types of tests, whether they be hormonal or even physical. So we would like to eliminate that in the first place because the main objective of this resolution is to debate whether gendered sports is good or not, and I believe the Gov is doing that, and the Ops should do that as well. So first, they stated that 4% of the population is intersex at most, and no, sorry, not right now, and that the vast majority are under binary. So for that reason, we should have gendered sports. And they also argue that that women may not be able to compete at the level of men, and that's why they need to stand out in their own leagues and be role models for other people growing up. We do agree that these women should be role models for future athletes growing up, but we would like to affirm that sports are inherently egalitarian. No, thank you, not right now. So. For example, the Olympics are all-inclusive. The only variable is physical ability. Athletic ability should prevail overall, and that for another example, in sports, no, thank you, not right now. So in sports, if I give an example such as Derrick Rose and a player from the WNBA, that person from the WNBA will be able to match up with Derrick Rose in certain. If this person was, for example, much taller than him, and then she would be able to beat him in the paint, but Derrick Rose would be able to beat her out in the perimeter because he's much quicker. And this is not determined on their gender; this is determined on height. No, thank you, not right now. And if you would go to a local park, and if I would go to a local park and lose to someone who is not male, that does not mean that it was just pure luck. And the hormonal balance is tipped in my favor even though I lost. It's because they're better and their gender does not necessarily matter. Their hormonal balance might still even be favoring them in some sort of way. And also, no, not right now, sorry. And so on our second point, we're creating equal playing field for people economically, and that right now female players are paid less in leagues throughout the world, and this is discrimination based on gender. They're not able to. Not right now. So this ties into our fourth point: how we're enhancing sports. We're popping these individual bubbles where players are only playing against specific genders. So men are only playing against men. So they're not able to experience how women play. Like for example, in the NBA, they never experienced what women in the WNBA play like. So there's sort of this gap in skill level, but also this lack of understanding. And players in the NBA and the WNBA are able to play cooperatively, then there will be an enhancement of skill overall, and that would then not only help humanity achieve or strive towards achieving peak performance, which is the goal of sports. Sorry, not right now. But also allow women to be in the same league and earn much more than they currently are.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so what incentive do team owners have to recruit women players if they are less skilled than their male counterpoints?
Right. So they do not have an incentive to recruit someone if they're worse at the sport. But if there are women that are better than men at sports, that's the point. So there are countless. Serena Williams is better than 99.9% of people on Earth in tennis. But yes.
Sorry. Why don't you engage with our argument that one example of a female quarterback or an extremely exceptional tennis player that still does not rank with regards to her counterparts in the male tennis world, that women still need role models, that women sports leagues help women see themselves in athletics?
Okay, so we know we're giving very small examples that might not include all of these types of sports and all these types of players. But when we talk about the largest sports and where tens of millions of people, even hundreds of millions of people watch the Super Bowl or they watch the NBA Finals and they watch predominantly male players play, that's because they're living inside this bubble. Male players are living inside this bubble right now, and the only way to burst that bubble is to allow women and men and all other genders to compete cooperatively. And you will see that there are some people who identify as non-male but are still better than men. And then they will be able to compete cooperatively, and then their ability to be a role model will be showcased in front of more people, so more people will be able to look up to these players that are playing cooperatively and realize that gender is not a barrier towards success. And we would like to reassert that we fight stereotypes and this harmful narrative that women and non-male genders are just inherently weaker, that overall peak performance and physical ability will prevail. Thank you.
The screen is off. Is that okay?
Turn the brightness up.
It's locked.
It seems like it's still recording, but I'm not sure.
Is it still recording?
Yeah, the green light's on, but that might just mean that the camera's on. Uh-oh.
That'd be bad.
Oh no, we're good. We're good.
Okay.
Okay, we can do it all again, guys.
Fuck that.
Now we can.
Wait,
Storm's nigh.
could I use someone else's timer?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's fine. What are teammates for?
Thanks, Dan. I'm Teal, by the way. Nice to see you. Cool. I'll begin. So they assume the government assumes that if we ban gender testing, then that'll magically create a world in which gendered sports simply don't exist anymore. And that's not what the motion says. The motion says that this House would ban gender testing in sports. Also, I'd like to point out that they attempted to squirrel on the definition of gender testing to get out of some of our arguments. The PM comes up and defines it as medical testing, and that's what it is. It's testing of someone's hormones and chemistry in their body that determine where they fall on a spectrum or really a binary of what gender they're in. But let's get back to this idea. So they all their arguments relate to this idea of how it would be so much better if there's a world without gender sports. But what they need to do and what they don't do is draw the link between banning gender testing and creating that world. And that's simply not the case. If we imagine a world in which today we remove gender testing, men's tennis and women's tennis will still exist. It'll just be harder for people to tell which of those two sections a person would go into. And instead, what coaches will do is base their determinations off of their feelings and things such as physical appearance, which we think are far more problematic than any notion of a medical examination, which could accurately determine where someone falls in terms of their hormones and chemistry in their bodies. So we think the world that they talk about is simply ludicrous and in absolute terms and isn't what's going to happen isn't what's going to happen if we ban gender testing. We'd also like to advocate or point out that we're simply saying that there shouldn't be a ban. So there are some cases where maybe it's good to not have gender testing, but our argument is there are also some cases in which, given that gendered sports do exist and will exist, it's okay and probably better to have gender testing as a method of determining where someone should play. So let's start off with this argument that they talk about how the best will rise to the top. And they create this very happy image of in the past sports has been used so that ideas like all these race, class, and sexual orientation identities don't matter anymore. But we think that's a false equivalency with gender and sex because they're very real biological differences in the hormones that someone has in their body that determine their ability to create muscle and have all these other physical attributes which are necessary for many sports out there and which are the reason that gender sports exist in the first place. So the idea of the best rising to the top simply isn't the case and isn't factual, no matter how much I or anyone else would like to believe that this is true. They talk about all these specific examples, such as Serena Williams, of athletes that are female who are freaking amazing. Yes, these people exist, but the reason that Serena Williams' name is so big, at least to some extent, is because it's semi-unusual for female athletes to be so freaking amazing. So we think that they're only able to draw on a few examples here, but generally speaking, men and women start off at different physical points in their ability to compete, and if they don't want to recognize or acknowledge that that's the case, they're ignoring factual reality and the hormones and chemistry that determines one's ability to create physical muscles and compete with each other. And we think that if there's a world in which gender testing, or in which gendered sports don't exist, then this would perpetuate ideas of male superiority because there's no acknowledgement of the physical differences that men and women start off at. So we think this world is bad and perpetuates the very inequalities that they seem to and want to talk about because it starts off at they don't acknowledge the very real differences between men and women in terms of muscle mass that I've talked about. So I'd like to expand on some points that Dan brought up. The first is that there's this idea of fairness. So in a world in which gender testing still exists, or gendered sports still exist, if there is no gender testing, then this will be open for people to abuse it. We think there are cases in which some people men will say that they're women just so that they can compete in women's leagues and abuse that to get access to fame and money. And there's definitely an incentive for this to happen. Let's say you're very good at tennis or some sport, but you're not the best at it, but in at least the men's category. But you could switch to the women's category and have all this access to money and fame and all these other factors that you want to have access to. There's a very real incentive for people to abuse this system if there isn't gender testing which determines whether someone is starting off at a fair playing field in terms of the hormones and chemistry of their body. We'd also like to acknowledge that, the government brought up this idea that, sex is something that you can't change. Yes, you can to some extent with, hormones and sex therapy and changes such as that. And we think that removing gender testing in a world in which gender tests exist is actually bad, because it opens up abuse for people. People can abuse not having this gender testing in the name of trans people. They could say, I'm a trans woman and compete in this, and there'll be all this public backlash to it as a result of this, and we think this will actually hurt the trans community because people will invalidate the trans identity and say, oh, hey, are you only identifying as a woman because you think it's you'll get more access to money? And that invalidates the trans identity, and we think that's bad. Also, we think this opens up the door to discrimination because if there's still, no matter what world exists, coaches will still care about the difference between men and women and people who physically appear as one or the other. So if there is no such thing as a medical gender testing to determine the difference, then coaches will just do it based off of however they're feeling that day, which we think is very problematic and exposes the relationship that coaches have with the people who they coach is one where they have a lot of power. They have control over what they physically do, the food that they eat, and the scheduling of these athletes. And if there's a world in which there isn't gender testing and trans people enter into it, we think there's a lot of abuse that can happen in this relationship, and it's worse for the marginalized culture through all these different forms of discrimination that we've already talked about. So I think what this debate boils down to is that the government so far has tried to draw this rosy picture of a world that doesn't have gendered sports in it. But that's not what the motion says. The motion is specifically about banning gender testing. And we think that is not the way to get to the world without gendered sports. In fact, we think it'll backfire because it opens this door for coaches to abuse the people under their power even more so, especially with the rise of discrimination as a result of this. And we also think that it's incredibly problematic, especially for the trans community, to no longer have or to get rid of a ban on gender testing in a world in which gender tests or gendered sports will continue to exist, and they simply don't draw that link that they won't. Thank you very much.
Here, here.
Oh, isn't Alana speaking first?
No.
I thought they were saying.
Those are just the teams.
Oh, yeah.
I wasn't aware.
Yeah, sorry. Did everyone realize that?
No. I thought the order was set.
Oh, we realized. Sorry. Well,
Jordan, what were you at? Do you guys realize
We
that?
did it in that order.
Yeah, I wanted
Okay.
to,
But it didn't, we decided between ourselves.
Okay, never mind. Okay.
so exciting. Okay. Partner ready?
I'm sorry.
Awesome. Honorable Speaker, we think that even if they're right, and gender testing, testing the physical attributes of a person's self in order to determine their gender is going to make a fairer playing field where women are now able to still participate in sports, because apparently we developed women's sports as a way to protect women from men and not as an exclusionary system where women weren't allowed to do male sports. We think that they still lose because we think that we're willing to sacrifice a tiny amount of fairness in the realm of sports if it means that you're not subjecting people to extreme personal humiliation as athletes, and you're not creating this idea in society that gender is something that can be physically tested, that there is this blood test that can determine whether you're male or female, and doesn't make children grow up thinking that these sports heroes they look up to are going to first be humiliated on national television, or second be excluded from doing what they want because of what this test says about who they are as a person. So I'm going to start with a little bit of rebuttal to what came out of opening opposition, and then go on to my extension, which is going to mainly focus on the personal humiliation and impacts on individuals, and then talk about a little bit of how this impacts society as a whole and why that's important. Okay, so what we get out of opposition is this idea that gender testing now is bad and that the status quo is bad, but that it could be good because in a few cases it could be used to legitimize people who are being treated poorly because they're not being allowed to identify the way that they want to. So there could be someone who is transitioning whose coach is no, you can't compete with the men, you have to compete with the women, but then this test gives them a little bit of legitimacy and they're able to compete the way that they want to. First, we think that this doesn't actually happen that often, right? I can't think of a single example where that is the case, and I think that most of the time people don't opt into this test, right? What we're saying is that we should ban sports as a whole, putting tests on individuals in order to allow them to compete, for example in the Olympics if they're competing in the men's category or in the women's category. We think that if individual people want to test themselves, that's fine. They can use that to talk to whoever's in charge, but we don't think that that is really what the impact of this debate is. What we think is that most of the time when this happens, it's not with women trying to go up and compete with men, because it's generally accepted, as it has been in this debate, that male sports are higher up than female sports because men have bigger muscles and shit like that. But we think that when this usually happens, it's with butch women, right? It's with women who have testosterone, more testosterone than normal, women who people don't think are as effeminate as they should be. And these people are then forced to undergo testing that makes them basically be put into one category or the other. We think that that is really harmful and more of what we're actually talking about here. So then we get this idea from opening opposition that that men are going to use this lack of a testing system to join women's sports in order to gain fame and fortune. We think that they take this argument down with their own logic because these men are going to see this as moving down, right? Because male sports are up here and female sports are down here. They themselves argue that women are paid less than men are, so it doesn't make sense why they'd want to move down. But we also think that this is a massive life change, right? Your gender identity is something that is very important to people and not something that you're going to change just to be able to play soccer or something like that. We do not think that very many people are actually going to be doing this, and we think that the idea of protecting women's sports from men who might try to impose on it is just absolutely ludicrous. We agree with opening government that ideally we're moving towards a world in which we don't have to identify gender for sport, right? We think that gender exists on a spectrum and is an important part of each individual person's identity, but not something that should be dictated and determining what you are and are not allowed to do. But we think that that does not get any better on side opposition, and that the impacts that they're trying to draw on of protecting a safe space of women's sports is not something that's actually going to be heavily impacted, because not a lot of these male athletes are going to be trying to take over women's sports. Okay, so sure.
Why don't you respond to our argument that the presence of gender testing might actually, or the lack of gender testing might subject many of the butch women that you might be talking about, when there is lack of clarity as to what their hormone balance might be, to undue criticism or to criticism that damages their ability to play on the field.
Yeah, so I think that first, this gender testing is not usually taken as definitive by the public as a whole. Right? They're still going to be getting criticism. You don't change that on your side of the house. But I think that it's fair to let people self-identify. And even if it creates a slightly less fair playing field in the Olympics or whatever it is, we don't think that that's really matters when you take in consideration the hardships on these individual people. I'll take anything from closing too. What do you guys have for me?
All right, so you're talking about how men wouldn't move down. The standards are different. So we're not talking about Michael Jordan moving down. We're talking about somebody that might not meet the qualifications for a professional male athlete, but do meet the qualifications for a professional female athlete. Please respond.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that, first, there is this massive amount of stigma that you guys are talking about in opposition, where, men are going to feel effeminate just by competing in a female sport, which means, not many of them are going to want to do that. But also, by their own logic, they're not going to be able to get the amount of like prestige that they are looking for in joining this sport if they're joining in the female sport. But secondly, we think that like it's fine if you're transitioning towards a world in which you don't have to like just play a sport as like a male sport or a female sport. If it means that like we're working towards everyone being in it together, and if you're having more men playing sports with more women, and they're able to realize that like women are able to play sports just as well as they are, you're more likely to get the world that opening government wants, which we think is probably good. Okay, so why does this create massive amounts of personal humiliation? We think that like these tests are put on people to determine their identity, because what you're saying is that you are not enough, that what you are saying about yourself is not enough to determine who you are and what sport you should be playing. That like instead we need to test your blood, something that is like not in your control in the same kind of way. And we think that is really harmful. But we also think that like just the idea that gender is something that can be physically tested is something that is incredibly harmful, that we want to get rid of in society, because we don't think that we should be perpetuating this idea that like it's your physical body that determines who you are. We think that like we want to be valuing people based on who they want to be in the world, who they say they are, and we think that you're not going to get the harms that opposition is talking about. Thank you.
Here, here. I'm short. Not that short. Like a little taller than that. All right. There we go. Okay. Hi, I am Saren. I'm going to turn on the brightness because this is distracting. Okay. Okay. All right, so first off, I'm going to correct a few misconceptions about this round. First off, we've been having trouble deciding whether we are or are not creating a world where we don't have gender in sports. I'm going to say that right now we are just talking about the ban on gender testing in sports, and it's probable that this ban will lead to a world in which we don't have gender tests, or that we don't have gendered sports. And I'm going to make a couple of arguments against both of these cases. So, first off, I wanted to talk about about opening government, how they brought to us this egalitarian world where everything is based on merit. And I'm going to talk to you about the problems with this. First, that women are on average 5 inches shorter than men. On average, probably 25 pounds, 50 pounds lighter than men on average. This is why gender divides exist. The only sport in which men and women compete on the same playing field is rock climbing, and there are not the same gender divides in rock climbing because there is a more even playing field, because strength and flexibility sort of even each other out. This is really, really important in this round because for every other sport, these divides do exist, and they are extreme. People keep bringing up Serena Williams. We don't think that it's that she's like the exception that proves the rule. We think that she actually has played tennis matches against her male contemporaries and lost. So she is the best female tennis player, and she still loses to some of the better male tennis players. We think this is really, really important because women will not be able to compete in athletics without the gender divide. Now we're going to give you a couple of warrants for that. Firstly, we think that professional sports, when we look at things like football in the United States, which our opponents brought up, when we look at things like basketball, these are really, really highly paid professions and are really, really widely watched. And we think that the main motive behind these sports is money for most professional sports and most places where you would have this gender testing. And we think that there is the main goals of sport are fairness, athletic merit, and competition. And we think that this is why there is this gender testing. And we think that in a world without gender in these things, these NBA, the National Football Leagues, the National Basketball Association would only hire the highest merit, and this would overwhelmingly be men. So women just would not be represented at all in the field of athletics. I'll take your question.
Yeah, so right now, the two things you're talking about, the football and basketball are all men, and the women's associations have much fewer views. They're paid like almost half as much, even when their teams are more competitively successful. You're not making that better on your side of the house, and this is non-clash.
Right, so we think this is going to be worse on your side. We don't have to make it better, as our opening brought up, but we do think that there are ways to make this better. We think that giving women better athletic prestige is really important. We don't think that taking women out of the equation altogether is a better thing, and we think that actually this would take all of the athletic prestige out of these sports, in particular where women are not generally competitive with men because of these biological differences, and we can use the terms estrogen and testosterone rather than women and men, because gender is a social construct. And so what we're talking about here are the biological difference, right? So when we're having these sports leagues of like estrogen and testosterone, the estrogen sports league is on average 5 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter, and that is not going to be competitive against the testosterone sports league. So we think that you're just taking women out of the equation pretty much altogether on their side of the house, and we think this is really, really harmful because women should be able to compete in athletic events. We think that people do at our college go watch the women's events. We think that people do go watch Serena Williams, and we think that if Serena Williams had to compete against the men in professional tennis, and she would lose because she has done this, that she would not have any of the fame, any of the fortune, and would not be the ideal that she is right now. So we think this is really, really important, and you wouldn't have Serena Williams on their side.
On this?
No. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about how our last half brought up that men wouldn't move down, but we've already again, since we're talking about biological differences, we've already seen a few different trans women compete in athletics and dominate their female fields. So we think that this is something that maybe should happen, but after this athlete is able to meet the standards of requirement hormonally in order to compete there. So we think that if you don't have this standard of the amount of testosterone you have to compete in this league, that we're basically going to be flooded with people that have enough testosterone to basically just wipe out anyone with estrogen. And we think this is really, really harmful, and we think that this outweighs a couple of the benefits that they may get on their side of one woman here or there being able to play on one sports team here or there. And we think overall, completely getting rid of all of the accolades, all of the money, and all of the fame and fortune and the idealism that comes behind female athletes in our world would just totally be gone. So we're not saying that it's perfect right now. We're just saying that their side totally gets rid of these benefits. Now, I want to go on a little bit more towards their point about how men wouldn't move down. We think this is a silly point because the standards are different. In order to get onto, I have friends. My friend has I took your question, has a 5-minute mile in cross country, and my other friend has a 6-minute mile. She is one of the best on the Princeton team, and he is one of the worst on the Rochester team. So there are these biological differences especially in things like running, and we think that when you can get rid of gender in things like rock climbing, this is fantastic, and we think this is already happening. When gender is unnecessary, when the gender divide is unnecessary, and they're basically balanced and even, and in this egalitarian world that they're talking about, this is already happening, and we are already having this push. We think that getting rid of these gender divides in things where it is really important, like running and like cross country, we think that this is really, really harmful. And we think that these impacts are really, really harmful. So the impact on our side is basically just getting rid of an entire gender and their athletics and accolades, and not even a gender, a sex, which happens to encapsulate half of the population. And on their side, they may or may not hurt a few women who could or could not join a team. Right. So, because of all of these reasons, including that we've been talking about these hormones as if they are gender, they are not gender, they are sex, and this is a really, really important divide. We wanted to clarify for the opening. We strongly urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I have water or something? I think it's the worst. 'Cause...
Awesome, guys. You got this, Alana.
Thanks.
Lana, if you'd like to take a break, we can pause.
Sorry. I just
Would you like to?
Just really quickly. Hi, I'm Alana. One second. Sorry, I think I just need to drink a little bit more water. My medication is really not like that. And sorry about that.
Don't be.
Okay. Okay, what I'm going to do is not only show you why the arguments coming out of opening opposition and closing opposition are inherently wrong, but I'm going to show you why our arguments on closing government, like, completely in every way outweigh our impacts and our warrants, the ones that my partner brought up, completely outweigh any of these impacts purported by opening opposition and closing opposition. So, first of all, I'm going to refute. I'm going to respond to closing or opening opposition. So they have this idea that like all these men are just gonna like take advantage of the system and like try to participate in women's sports to like get money or fame or whatever. However, like in the status quo, as it was brought up by the government side, like men, because women, there's been all these characterizations throughout the debate that like women's sports are like way less competitive, and like that men's sports are like way, men are just like inherently better in every way.
Point of information.
No, thank you. No, thank you. However, like we would like to point out that like the impacts, the like potential outcome of like some people changing their gender identity to participate in the other gender sport and like maybe get some money, like that is just not that is not like it's not only like a very small proportion of the population of athletes that are going to change their gender identity and like identify as a woman or as a man just to get like a competitive advantage. That is unrealistic. And also there are other reasons for people, as it was brought up, that people like change their gender identity. Of course, it's like it's like gender is a binary, as GovSide has brought up, and all right. Sorry.
Information?
No, thank you. All right, and then and also we see this coming out of closing opposition. They say that like getting rid of gender testing would lead to like gender being ended in sports. However, same with like opening opposition. Would so many people be changing their gender identity for like the sake of competitiveness or sports or like shallow winnings? Like gender identity is obviously something much more than sports. It's somebody's whole life. Additionally, no thank you. Additionally, they say that women should be able to compete, and like this is their big impact on closing opposition. Like we need to like protect women. We need to have these like different gender, like a women's sport and a gender sport. However, we on closing government would like to point out, as my partner brought up, that like intersex people and people who don't necessarily fit into like the gender binary, like their participation in sports is like it matters too, and like this and yeah. So yes.
So we'd like to point out the mischaracterization of our argument that men would be invading women's sports, whereas we just said that the lack of this test would open up to criticisms of the invalidation of athletes, and this test could indeed validate the identities of some athletes that would otherwise not have any means to be validated as not just identifying as a woman,
Right, thank you.
but as being hormonally a
You
woman.
know what validates the gender identities of people, of athletes, is their self-identification, as my partner brought up. The test has been characterized as being involuntary. It's harmful. It's humiliating. Athletes should be able to self-identify in sports, and this actually levels the playing field. And I'll get into that later. No, thank you. So what the opposition bench has argued is that we need to keep this invasive, this singling out of people who are androgynous, maybe, or people who, you can't tell at a glance if they're a man or if they're a man or a woman. This is really harmful, as the Gov bench has pointed out. Singling out these athletes. No, thank you. Singling out these athletes and invading their privacy. This is what's wrong, and saying that some people won't be able to participate because they don't they don't reach this threshold of estrogen or testosterone, which it's not true. It's not to have these two different categories, men and women, estrogen, testosterone. What about all those people on the binary who don't fit into either of those? Side opposition in their world, they just ignore all these people that wouldn't even be able to participate. Because there's a huge gap between between these testosterone and estrogen levels.
On that?
No, thank you. And also, I'd like to build on my partner's point that so a lot of side opposition has said this would lead to fairness and the playing field. However, my partner mentioned that there are a lot of things that are more important that also factor into playing field and fairness, resources and things that aren't that are out of our control. Therefore, the arguments of closing government by saying our arguments that are against this invasion of privacy, this singling out and humiliation, personal humiliation of these athletes that need to take this involuntary test. The personal effects of this are very strong. Like my partner mentioned, this can lead to identity crises, mental health crises. Therefore, this isn't about should we have gendered, as bench has characterized the debate. It's not. It's should we have gendered competition, closing opposition has said. It's we shouldn't have this invasive involuntary test that completely throws out the idea, the so important idea of self-identification, because in their world, it's all about competitive advantage and who wins. But we would like to argue that participation and self-identity and respect of self-identity for people who are not who do not see themselves as men or women outweighs any of these potential cheating or potential uneven level playing field. So for these reasons, we strongly encourage you to side with closing government. Thank you.
How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm on a blood thinner, so.
Okay. Do you need anything?
All right, I'm Garrett. Okay. So ultimately, it seems that this round has kind of been muddled by the definitions that have been given by the open government and the model that has been provided, as well as the definitions of what is gender and how should these distinctions be made. And my partner comes up here and clarifies the distinctions that we're trying to make. Right? We're she says that we're not having like a women's league and a men's league on our side of the house, but rather we're having like a testosterone league and like an estrogen league. So it's like equitable for people who have the same level of like, who have the same like bodily composition to compete against each other, right? Because no matter like what your gender identity is, it necessarily doesn't like mean that your physical ability matches your gender identity. And that's what we want to point to and focus on our side of the house, especially in the closing opposition. So what is the most important metric in today's round that you need to like adjudicate by? It is which side provides the greatest equity, not necessarily the greatest equality, right? So what's the difference between these two things that have been heatedly debated? So first, on the government side, like they want equality for all genders, or like regardless of your hormonal level, right? So they want people on the same playing field, they want people on the same basketball court, and like yes, that's like what they're vouching for. And I'll go into like why this doesn't happen later, and my partner also said this, but what we get on our side of the house is equity, right? So people get the same footing with the same skill level so that they can compete against people of the same like competency within that sport. And yeah, so I'll take closing.
Yeah, there's so many more meaningful ways that people have different abilities in sport, like height, or like your background, how much money you've had, how fast your muscles recover. Why are you basing this divide on gender? And don't you think that the people who are most hurt are the people who are in the middle?
Okay, well, yeah, so you guys bring up the point about like people in the middle, but like there's still going to be a divide based on hormones, and if you have a hormonal composition that's more in line with testosterone, you're going to be in testosterone leagues. Our side doesn't disenfranchise people who are intersex or transgender. It just makes it a fair playing field for everyone, which is the whole purpose of sports in the first place, which my partner brings up, right? Because we want people to have the same amount of like competition, the same fairness, and the same representation within sports, right? And my partner brings this up. We like sports teams and sports owners don't have an incentive to hire women, or don't have incentive to hire women on the government side of the house. Why is this case? Because one, sports teams and sports owners want to make as much money as possible. How does this happen? They get the most skilled players who have an advantage over other people. Like if you have a world where you have one like gender playing, or a multi-gender playing field, then who's going to have the advantage? The people with a physical advantage over everyone else. In this situation, it is men, because men are stronger, they're taller on average, and they weigh more. Like this is obviously a great advantage over women. So and moreover, and so since women are more physically inferior, like sorry, like third wave feminism movement, but like that's like the case. Like they can't beat men. So sports teams don't. I mean, people with estrogen, high amounts of estrogen. That's what I mean. Sorry. So there's no reason to recruit or hire people with high amounts of estrogen and low amounts of testosterone because they're more likely to lose. So why is this important? Because none of these people with high amounts of estrogen and lower amount of testosterone will become hired, and therefore you have lower participation among people who identify. People with high estrogen levels who have most of them happen to be women. Moreover, women, like people with high amounts of estrogen level and low amounts of testosterone, will be even more disenfranchised because they won't have any representation in the public image. My partner comes up here and says that like the NBA and the NFL and like all these other different sports, like they gain large amounts of viewership, and they gain large amounts of capital from that viewership. And if you don't have the representation of someone who has like less testosterone, then like people who are like you won't have that representation, and therefore you have people with high amounts of testosterone dominating those spots, which most of the time which we necessarily call men. So men will end up dominating the sports, and they won't be like any women. Like, sorry, these are messy definitions of the round, but that's just how it kind of came out to be. So why is it important that we have equity, right? I've kind of gotten into this, right? So, like an equity, have equal footing on an equal playing field with equal like feet. Like, so what you have is that like you have like people competing against each other in fairness and in the same competency, and you won't have any sort of like person, regardless of their gender identity, like over competing someone unfairly, right? Because the whole point of sports is like fairness and a meritocracy, and if that meritocracy necessarily disenfranchises people with different bodily compositions, then necessarily it is not like the purpose of sports is not upheld. Moreover, on this side of the house, if you just like want like equality for everyone in the same playing field, like the whole tenet of like equality won't even be held up in the first place because you'll have men dominating the sports. Like this is the most important thing in today's round because what we can get on the gov bench is pretty much men dominating sports. People who have high amounts of testosterone dominating sports, which most likely happen to be people who identify as men. But on our side of the house, you get like the optics of having like a fair playing field, and you can have okay, I'll take Alana.
Do you deny the psychological self-harm that would be done to people who don't fit into a gender and are like forced to like take this test, and then they're like, if they don't fit into the men or women's category, like, do you deny that self-harm?
Okay, so one, like, this testing is mandatory for everyone. It won't be targeting a single group of, like, people. It won't, like, be targeting just people who are androgynous or just people who are transgender or just people who are intersex, right? Because this is, like, testing that happens against everyone so that they're on the same playing field. This happens to everyone. It won't necessarily single out a single person that the closing government is focusing on, because this applies to everyone. Like, you could have, like, cis men, like, entering into the women's field, or you could have like cis women who have high amounts of testosterone entering into the men's field and then being competent there. And like this also provides greater optics, because if you see that like there's a woman with like a large amounts of testosterone like competing against men, that also provides greater representation of like the feats of women. And so ultimately what you have to weigh is that on the government side of the house, regardless of how you model it, like you won't get the fair representation of gender in sports, and you'll just have men dominating. But on the op bench, especially the closing government, what we get is equity for genders and equal representation of all gender identities.
Here.
That's most important. Thank you.
Here.
Yeah, how do I do it?
Just press the stop button.
It's black.
The password.
Charlie,
Charlotte,
don't do that.
Oh, it's black. I wish I'd gotten black one.